chapter here. Tonight my job is to introduce our speaker. Born in Dublin, Mr. Dony Manus graduated with a Bachelor of Design in 1995 and a higher diploma in Art and Design teaching in 1998 at the National College of Art and Design in Dublin. Later he went on to study a Master's in Fine Art in 2001 at the New York Academy of Art. He spent some time in Florence and Rome working on his art, and he returned back to Dublin in 2004 to establish the Irish Academy of Figurative Art. In late 2007, McManus returned to Florence to develop a sacred art studio in the monastery of San Marco. While in Italy, Mr. McManus gained a master's in architecture, art, and liturgy in 2010. The studio then became so successful that the Archbishop of Florence asked Mr. McManus to personally found a diocesan sacred art school. Mr. McManus left Florence in 2014 to develop sacred art studios in order to work on large liturgical art commissions. Since then, he has been working in Dublin, recently moving to Washington, D.C. Please give a warm welcome to Mr. Dony McManus.
Thank you very much. So I have basically a talk which comes mostly from experience. The only authority I have is my experience. So what I'm going to be talking about essentially is the trajectory of my career. I'll try to go through that as fast as possible so that we can get to the really interesting part, which is the questions and answers, the dialogue. So I'm going to be raising a few issues and ideas that might spark a conversation. So that's really the idea here. So the talk is why beauty matters, and I hope that that will emerge through the talk. Unfortunately, my son Dony couldn't make it, so I'm going to give the talk. It's a bit of an old photograph. So I'm going to start off where I started off, basically in Dublin in the 1990s, where I was basically kicked out of the fine art department because I was too Catholic and too figurative. So I ended up in the the craft design department, where I became a silversmith and a goldsmith because I wanted to cast bronze. That was the main reason I went into this department. And in that department, I also had a bit of a rough ride because the anti-Catholicism, and they gave me the lowest mark possible for graduating, but I got Graduate Designer of the Year award, and my work was selected for to launch the Contemporary Silver Collection in the National Museum in the same year, so the same show. So it just gives you an idea of the prejudice against what I was doing, but the wider community understood what I was trying to do. So this is in the National Museum, this piece that started the Contemporary Collection. After that, I actually went back into sculpture and became a professional sculptor. And this is the first commission I did, and this was the cover of the Irish Times, which is kind of like the New York Times of Ireland, which is very anti-Catholic, but they really appreciated what I was doing in taking the Virgin Mary and bringing the iconography forward, dealing with contemporary problems of addiction, in particular alcohol and drug addiction. So the Virgin is standing on the contemporary serpent of a drug and alcohol symbol, so the syringe and bottle. So it's kind of a very clear iconography I was using for people who are suffering from addiction. And the chain at the bottom is breaking the chain of addiction. So it was for a drug rehabilitation centre in a very difficult area in Dublin. So that's really what I was doing. And it's basically the image was Our Lady of Hope. And I was interested, it was commissioned by an ex-Marxist who converted to Catholicism. And he was the person who commissioned me to do this. So it's really interesting to work with an ex-Marxist in a drug rehabilitation centre in West Dublin, using Christian iconography to elevate the culture. This was the media response to my sculpture. This is the sculpture in the background, and that's the Archbishop of Dublin. So it just gives you an idea of the tone of dialogue within Ireland at the time. Shortly after that, I did this image, which is the Lionsman, and this is a bronze sculpture of a working man who built, these are the people who built Dublin in the previous century, the turn of the 19th century. So these are the men who pull the barges in for the Guinness barges to load them up and bring Guinness across the Atlantic to you guys. So this was across from the IFSC, which is the Irish Financial Services Centre, which is like the Wall Street of Dublin. That's the powerhouse that built Celtic Tiger, which you probably heard of, which was really the economic renewal of Ireland. But these are the working people on which that city was built, and that's why I wanted to pay tribute to these people. So that was the first or the second public commission I did. The way I approached it was to build it in clay first. So this is to understand the process of bronze casting, which is most of what you're going to see here. It's built in clay first, and then once it's built in clay, then there's a rubber mold to take the detail. And then there's a plaster jacket on top of the rubber mold to hold the form, all right? And then you open up the mold to clean it out, and this is like the inside of the foot, for instance. These are the laces of the shoe. And then you paint wax inside of that, so it's about a 5 millimeter, that thickness, maybe half your pinky. And it's a bit like a chocolate Santa or Easter egg. You have that layer on the inside, and then you pull that wax, hollow wax from the mold, and you reassemble the figure as we're doing here. And then that's invested in ceramic shell. You melt out the wax, and you pour in molten bronze into the ceramic shell while it's still white hot. And then you crack off that shell, and then you're left with the hollow bronze. Does that make sense? And then you weld all those parts together to get this. So that's how your public sculpture is done in bronze. It goes right back to the 5th century BC Greek style. Shortly after that, I went to the New York Academy. I had to leave Europe to study in the United States to understand European art. Okay? To give you an understanding. Europe is really suffering from a cultural repudiation, as the philosopher Roger Scruton phrased it. I was blessed to spend a number of meals with Roger Scruton, who is Sir Roger Scruton. He died 1 or 2 years ago, and he was a great help for me to understand what I was doing, because Sir Roger Scruton was probably the premier conservative philosopher in Britain, and he helped me understand what I was going through, which is basically a culture of repudiation. So in Europe, we rejected our culture, and the Americans have still a tendency to respect it and honor it. And I found that in the New York Academy of Art in New York. And that's where I studied for 2 years, from 1999 to 2001. And this is the first sculpture I did there, which is basically the resurrection of Christ, the resurrection of Christ, which I did as a study, an anatomical study. So half it is bone structure, the other half is muscle structure. So I'm trying to understand the most important reality in my life, which is the existence, the incarnation essentially, of Christ. So I'm trying to understand the incarnation in my primary grammar, which is form. So to understand the incarnation through form, you need to understand bone structure and muscle structure, okay? Artistic anatomy. So that's what I'm wrestling with here in this piece. Then I decided for my diploma project to do a crucifix and to study the crucifix as the premier icon of the incarnation, where God essentially gives himself to man. So this is my body given up for you, okay? Like in the Eucharist or in the incarnation itself. So in order to do that, I got these huge Con Edison beams from the street. So these are like 12 foot by 12 foot beams of wood. I got some friends of mine to take them up from the streets of Manhattan up onto the 3rd floor and then bolt them to this pole, and then I crucified my friends on it. So literally, I was wondering, oh my God, how am I going to convince models to pose for this? But actually, friends of mine did it voluntarily. people who are coming back to the faith, who are embracing the faith, they started to identify with this, what I was doing, and they actually volunteered to pose for it, which is fantastic. So that's me working on the crucifix, and this was the finished piece, which in plaster. So unfortunately it's a bit damaged, there's some blood on it there. That was during the fire at graduation in 2001. At the graduation show, the school went on fire. The third floor and second floor burnt out and fell down on the first floor, which was where the exhibition was in Tribeca Hall. So the director's office actually came down on top of this crucifix and smashed the arms off to replace them. And the two firemen that rescued this were killed 2 weeks later in September 11. So it was a very traumatic period. A number of very dark things happened during that period. One of the kids I was looking after in the Bronx, I was doing some youth work in the Bronx, their father committed suicide in front of the family, which was very tragic. And then a guy above my apartment in Queens committed suicide. I found him 3 o'clock in the morning on the ground in a pool of blood. So it was a very difficult period. I went back to Ireland to get some respite after September 11 and all that. And of course my brother picked me up to tell me that a friend of ours, a mutual friend of ours, killed his wife and 2 kids and tried to commit suicide. So it was a really, really tragic time. I went to visit him in hospital, in prison, and shortly after that I went to Rome. And so my head was in a very dark space at that time. The only thing I could think of while I was going to St. Peter's every day was a plane flying into the dome of St. Peter's. That's all I could think of. It was kind of a very strange time in our history. And as therapy, I decided, not actively, but I just knew I needed to study the Pietà. I was there to work on a commission for a 5-foot marble, or 5-meter marble bronze for the exterior of St. Peter of St. Josemaria Escrivá, founder of Opus Dei. That was the main reason I was in Rome. But while I was there working on trying to get that commission, I did 3 drawings of the Pietà by Michelangelo in St. Peter's. And I found that very therapeutic. It healed my faith in God, faith in humanity, and my vocation as an artist became very clear, to the extent that I realized that if Michelangelo can heal me after 400 years of distance through the beauty of this work, which ironically is an icon of deicide. This is the death of God. But even something so horrific could be so beautiful, could bring out so much beauty. And this Pietà was that for me. Drawing it from 3 different angles, 1 week per drawing, healed my understanding of what my vocation was as an artist. So if I can bring forward maybe a fraction of what Michelangelo has achieved in this piece, then my life would be worthwhile. And that's why I invested the rest of my life into becoming an artist. This is a clay sketch for St. Joseph the Child of Jesus for the Catholic Information Center in Washington, D.C. This is the full-size bronze, so I came back to New York to do that. Then I did this piece in Rome, which is a bust of St. Josemaria Escrivá. So he is in the wall there. They asked me to do a life-size bronze for this chapel, but I felt it would be too dominant. It wouldn't respect the hierarchy that's necessary in a chapel. So the most important thing in a chapel is the real presence of our Lord in the Blessed Sacrament. Second to that would be the altarpiece, artistically, and then the third item would be the sacred art. So I wanted it very much to be in the third place. So the way I did that was to set him into the wall so that when you walk into the chapel from this direction, you see him, but you're directed towards the tabernacle. Okay? So I learned that from Bernini. I made this in Rome when I was studying Bernini sculpture, and he uses this theatrical way of triangulating your attention. So you look at one piece, but that draws you to another. Okay, so when you look at the image of Saint Escriva was all about bringing us to our Lord. So not only do you have an image of the saint, but you have a central idea, which is to go to Christ. Okay, so that was done in bronze, and then it was gold gilt. So that was a really nice technique to work. So there's another Bernini technique of pushing back the dark and pulling up the light, which is like a chiaroscuro, which is Caravaggio used in his painting, which is a very Baroque technique, very theatrical. It adds an impact and a punch. Okay. Another thing that gives punch is to give bones and muscles to the work, so that there's a real presence. And I mean that in the context of George Steiner, the Jewish philosopher. He talks about real presence with a small p. So making somebody really present. In order to do that, an artist has to understand bone structure and muscle structure, so as to render the person before them as an anatomical reality within perspectival space. So there are layers and layers of grammar in order to enter into the reality. It's a bit like the English language, or the Italian language if you're reading English, if you're reading Shakespeare, Italian if you're reading Dante, Russian if you're reading Dostoevsky. You've got to understand the grammar to enter into the reality of the culture. And an artist does the same thing. He takes a grammar and he uses that grammar to enter into that visual reality, so as to penetrate the depths of that anatomical reality within perspectival space, and then bring forward that reality, dialogue with it, and then bring it forward in their work. Okay, I don't know if that makes sense. So it's something that we have lost. It's an understanding that we have lost in our culture to our detriment. It has impoverished us to a tremendous degree, to the extent that there are very few examples of that level of understanding and beauty in our contemporary culture. And that's something I want to bring forward. All right? This is why beauty matters, because beauty gives us access to truth and goodness, so as to replenish our soul, to sanctify us essentially, to elevate us, and to elevate our culture, and to bring that forward to the next generation. Okay, we have no right to deny the next generation what we have inherited. That's the central theme of what I'm talking about. This is a marble bust of the same piece. So just to understand how marble works, so this is a plaster that was taken from the same mold, and I'm translating that into marble here. And that's another technique that gives you a tremendous respect for form. That's why marble carving is so important, because when you realize that you can only go one direction with marble, you can't reverse. It's like watercolor painting. Once the mark is down, you can't take it up. Okay, but marble is much more serious, obviously, because if you take the nose off, it's gone. Okay, and that gives you a tremendous respect for the material. This is my mea culpa, mea maxima culpa. This is my exploration into modernism, which was a pure accident, if you ask me. Essentially, I was competing for about 30 commissions while I was in Ireland for about 5 years. And during that period, I missed the application for one competition, and I had 3 hours to pull something together. I found the application form underneath my bed. So I pulled it out and I basically scribbled this design up. Of course, is the least meaningful piece that I did in 5 years was the one that won. Okay, it was selected because it means absolutely nothing. Okay, the reason why this exists is because it is void of meaning. Okay, it doesn't have any figures because the body means something. Your body means something. Okay, your body has a grammar. Your body speaks volumes about something very phenomenal, which is love. Your body is designed to give yourself to another person. It's a very powerful reality, okay? this is void of meaning. That's why it wasn't threatening to the committees that selected it, and that's why it was selected. Okay, so this is my mea culpa, which actually helped me fund the first school I founded, which is the Irish Academy of Creative Arts. So that's my excuse for this piece. I did this shortly afterwards, the Virgin Child from my local church. And then when I left Ireland, the Irish Times, which is the newspaper record, did this article, released this article. It was a full-page article, which was a bit of a shock for me because it was a very anti-Catholic newspaper. But it did a very good article on what I was trying to do in Ireland. It's my son again. And then this is St. Joseph and the Child Jesus. This is in Florida. So this was commissioned by a lady who liked the one in DC, but wanted the Joseph to kissing the child. So I said, well, I have to do a new piece. You can't just push bronze like that. So she said, okay, commission that. So when she commissioned this, she asked me to change the head 5 times, which was interesting. So I changed it 5 times, but the 5th time I said, okay, I'm just going to do the first head because I really like that one. So I redid the first head, and she said, yeah, that's the one I want. So I said, okay, I'm not going to say anything, just cast in bronze and send it. So that's in Florida, Tallahassee. And this is a Holy Family, which is based on that. It's a small bronze. So it's basically the active Joseph and the contemplative Virgin, and that's the idea. And this torch here is the torch that the foundry uses to heat up the bronze. So it's to spray. You spray different types of acids on the bronze, and then you torch it, and that brings out the natural color of the bronze. That's how it's called patina. Okay. So when you see different colors on bronzes, it's not paint. It's actually patina, which is the inner color, which is drawn out by different types of acids at different temperatures. Okay. Now, while I was in the New York Academy of Art, I studied anatomy as a grammar. So this was a very scientific reductionist approach. So the New York Academy took up from the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, which was the French Academy. And that was brought together by David, Ingres, and Jerome, okay, in service of the French Revolution. All right. So the whole idea behind it was very much a rejection of Christianity as a culture, as a very Masonic inspiration, where it would take up the techniques of the French or the Spanish and Italian masters, and they would rip the soul out of it, which was basically Christian spirituality, and leave us with a shell, which is basically scientific reductionist analysis of artistic technique. So you would get anatomy, you would get the technique of Velázquez, or the technique of Botticelli or Bernini, but you would not inherit the spiritual inspiration behind it. Okay, so it's basically ripping the soul out of that artwork. So the New York Academy inherited that, so it was basically bringing back that academic understanding. So to understand the lineage, so you have the bottegas, the workshops in Florence. So Michelangelo, Raphael, and Leonardo came from the studios of Ghirlandaio, Perugino, and Verrocchio. Okay, so it's a workshop. And they did apprenticeship, and from that apprenticeship, they learned from the master, and they became great artists. So the difference it's the transition between the craftsman, the artigiano, and the artist. The transition is that the artisan is just a maker, but an artist is a maker who thinks. Okay, so it's the philosophy and theology that Michelangelo inherited from the Medici court that made him an artist. Does that make sense? So essentially, it's an artisan who's thinking. So you're thinking with your hands. Okay, so my understanding, the ideas I'm transmitting to you primarily comes through my hands and my brain. Okay, so I'm assimilating these great masters through my hands and my brain, living there and working with these masters. Okay, So what's happening here is that, so you have that transition from the workshop, the bottega, the Florentine bottega, that was turned into the Florentine Academy through Vasari, who was the first art historian, who was a friend of Michelangelo. And he established the Academy in Florence, the Accademia delle Arti di Firenze, where I studied for 2 years. That created this academic style, which was very rigid and very rule-based, and that became calcified in the French Academy, the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, which gave rise to the salons in Paris, and it was the salons that became so rigid that the Impressionists reacted against it because it was so rigid, with their new free understanding of painting. And then post-impressionism, and then modernism, and then postmodernism, which we have, okay? So they're all reactions against this, all right? So, and the New York Academy is basically a reaction against the modernism to bring more discipline. So understanding, reintroducing the French academic style, okay? So I don't think that's going far enough. I think there's a necessity to go right back to the bottega, because the bottega is the best place to understand, it's the best place to learn, is through an apprenticeship, okay? Because you're learning about the technique, about the grammar in its full context, which is the full economy. So you're not just doing things academically, you're doing things within a studio where you're learning from the master, you're sweeping the floor, you're learning the technique, you're learning how to do the books, you're learning how to deal with the client, okay? So you're fully involved with the economy, but you're not only fully involved with the natural economy, but also the supernatural economy, because you're dialoguing with priests, theologians, you're serving a liturgy, which is the leading force behind the culture, and that is really crucial for us to understand, especially in contemporary culture, because essentially there are three elements. You've heard of politics being downstream from culture, right? But culture is downstream from cult, religion, okay? So for instance, in Clemson, the primary cult will probably be the Tigers, okay? So that is the primary cult of this university, possibly. So that is what people are celebrating the most. So that influences the way we think, okay? So it's really important to understand those directly. So if the cult is correctly ordered, then the culture will be correctly ordered, and then the politics will be correctly ordered. So essentially what the New York Academy was doing is going back into that academy style, but I needed to bring that further. So in order to do that, I needed to steep myself in the grammar, the incarnation with a small I, so as to reach the incarnation with a capital I. Okay, and I'll show you how I did that. So the first thing is to understand the body as a machine, as a grammar. So I dissected the body into each muscle, but then I set them into groups, so that it's much easier to understand, because it's quite intimidating to study a whole body with all the Latin names for each muscle, although it's very helpful to understand them. But if you understand them as groups, it's much easier. And then if you color code them into complementary colors for complementary actions, it's way easier. So, for instance, this green group here are extensors, all right? The red group are flexors, all right? It's trying to look a bit of Monty Python here, but the Ministry of Film and Funny Walks. So you have the green and red, so they're complementary colors for complementary actions. So I can stand on one leg because both are working together. It's really interesting to understand this, not just as artists, but as human beings. This is a miracle design that we all have, and we need to respect and understand. Then there's the blue, which are abductors, like alien abduction, and orange as adductors, the pectoralis muscle, okay? Complementary color for complementary actions, all right? And then I have yellow as rotators, okay? So with those 5 groups, you basically understand everything about what the body's doing, okay? So that's a unique thing that I put together so as to study, so that's really the anatomical logic, okay? The reason I put that together, and I did this, which is kind of interesting, this drawing was done in Beato Angelico's studio. Do you know who Beato Angelico is? Fra Angelico? Anybody? Fra Angelico? Yeah?
Yeah, he was an artist he did San Marco, the fresco paintings.
Exactly. So this was done in San Marco. Okay? I was given Fra Angelico's studio for 2 years by the Dominicans. This is the first thing I did, completely inspired. Because it's the first time I had a decent studio, so I did put up this drawing and did life-size sculpture drawings of this. And then I pulled out this grant. So that was the first thing I did. The next thing I did was to study this Pontormo drawing. Pontormo is another Florentine master. He was a student of Michelangelo's. And the reason I studied him is because he abstracted the form in an extraordinary way. All right? Because what he did was the Renaissance brought in the humanities, basically inspired by St. Francis of Assisi. St. Francis of Assisi is really the ground zero of Western culture. Okay? The reason why goes right back to the key word that I want you to remember: incarnation. Okay? Francis of Assisi, his whole being was about understanding and penetrating the fullness of Christ's humanity. Okay? That is the ground zero of Western culture with regard to Christianity, how we separated from the East. All right? Eastern, up to that, it was all about the divinity of God. St. Francis really introduced us to the humanity of Christ, which gave us the Christos sufferens, Christ suffering on the cross, the way of the cross, the presepe, the crib. All of these come from St. Francis of Assisi. All right? Contemporaries of him were Giotto and Dante. Okay? Two of the founding artists of Western culture, profoundly influenced by St. Francis of Assisi. Giotto gave us artistic anatomy, so as to understand, to bring Christ into our space. He gave us perspective to bring Christ into our space, and he gave us natural light to shine light on the form so as to bring that form into our space. All right? So St. Francis of Assisi is key to our culture. What happened from that, we got the High Renaissance with Raphael, Michelangelo, and Leonardo, and Titian. And then after that, we got Mannerism, and one of those Mannerists is Pontormo. And what Pontormo did, which was really interesting, is he brought this carnal reality back into the sacred space. So he took away the perspective, he took away the depth of space, and he elevated these forms into the air. So this form is dancing, okay? This is the angel Gabriel in the Visitation, the most sacred moment in history, directly linked with the incarnation, okay? So here we have an incarnate being. He's kind of like the El Greco he's like the Italian version of El Greco. He has a supernatural aspect to his work. But the interesting thing for me as a sculptor is that it's very closed form, it's very three-dimensional, it's very solid. You can see the bones, you can see the muscles, all right? But he has them elevating in the air. So I was wondering, how did he do this? So why don't I analyze this mystical image, this supernatural image, with a scientific reductionist grammar, so as to bridge the gap between the 16th century and the 21st century, so that I can communicate to contemporary artists and contemporary people how this work has been created. So separating the oil from the water. So the first thing I did was basically to put this transparency on top of this drawing and pull out the bone structure. Okay? And when you do that, you see that the rib cage is twice life size. Why? Because he's inhaling the Holy Spirit. Okay? You also notice that the bone structure, when you study the bone structure, you see that the figure is dancing, okay? Because the bones don't change shape, so you know the movement of the form. The next thing I did was I put on another transparency on top of that to pull out the muscle structure. And then I color-coded it so that you not only understand that the muscles are abstracted to communicate graceful movement, so you have the larger here and narrower here, so it's like tapering. to create that graceful movement, but also when you understand the complementary muscles groups, you can see that the muscles are in tension and flexion, so they're actually dancing. And the next thing I did after that was to do the drapery over here in purple. So you notice that the drapery is another layer of grammar. So the bone structure is one layer, the muscle structure is the next layer. The third layer is the drapery. And the drapery is also abstracted. It's not drooping with gravity like me here, but it's actually billowing with the wind of the Holy Spirit. Okay? So every layer of grammar that Pontormo is projecting in this image is abstracted by a supernatural reality. Okay? So we're using a scientific reductionist grammar to analyze a mystical work, and by doing that we separate the spiritual from the natural, so that you can see the evidence of the natural, of the supernatural. And it was this 5-minute demonstration is what Osamu, one of my students, said when he came out of the Duomo after being baptized. He's one of 14 of the students that were baptized through studying this. He said that it was this 5-minute demonstration that convinced him that he had to become Catholic in order to create this work. Because there's no way you can project this level of beauty without that understanding. Essentially, truth, goodness, and beauty, the three transcendentals, are intrinsically linked together. You cannot separate them. And if you do, you suffer tremendously. And the Roman Catholic Church has totally dropped the bomb with regard to the ball. Dropped the bomb. With regard to beauty in the last century at least, because we're suffering tremendously because of it. We need that beauty, whether it's music, art, or whatever, architecture. So this is and this is what the three layers on top of each other. So you have the drapery, the muscle structure, and the bone structure. It looks kind of psychedelic, but if you can understand, this is how Pontormo saw. This is how Pontormo conceived. Essentially, drawing is 90% of any work of art. And this is how he drew, with that understanding. This is, these are students in Beato Angelico studio. This is the studio I had. These are some of my students. They're studying anatomy in three-dimensional form, so it's teaching that whole thing in 3 dimensions. Some of these are really top artists now, thank God. And that's Osamu actually there in the background with the hat on. He's the guy who converted. He was a kid from Tokyo who he came over to Italy to restore art, restore essentially Christian art. And he says that Christian art restored him, which is kind of an interesting play. This is an article by the La Nazione, which is a national newspaper of record in Italy. And this is on the bones of Beato Angelico. This is about my studio and the work we were doing there. And these are some of the artists that converted to Catholicism. This is the Cardinal Archbishop of Florence baptizing these artists in Florence. And this is the father of one of the artists and his grandson. They were baptized the year after with Osamu. So it was a very interesting period. This is some of the work these artists were doing after being baptized. It's pretty impressive, you know. This is Osamu with his artwork. No. Osamu is a painter. That's not him. So here are some of the artists here teaching the next generation of artists. This is a group called Piccolo Michelangelo, which is set up to help the young children in Florence understand their heritage as well, because unfortunately they've forgotten. Actually, I was walking back from back home one day, and I saw these about 40 teenagers with a spray can, a red spray can, spraying on top of this sculpture, and I literally saw red. I just marched up to them, grabbed the can, and I lectured them for about probably about a minute, in pretty strong Italian. And I marched off, and I was just praying to my guardian angel as I was marching off because the 40 teenagers could do a lot of damage. But it was shortly after that I realized I had to pay back, and that's why I started that group of kids, because these kids really need to understand what their heritage is. This is an altarpiece I designed for Rome, which ended up as this here, a bronze piece. So it's basically a tabernacle. This is for Rome, so it's Omnis cum Petrum ad Jesum per Mariam, all with Peter to Jesus through Mary. And then there's the tabernacle on the door of the tabernacle are it's written the 12 tribes of Israel, written in Hebrew. So this is the temple of the Old Testament, surmounted by the temple of the New Testament, which is the dome of St. Peter's. And then the Virgin is behind us, so the Virgin was the original tabernacle. And she's calling down the Holy Spirit on the church. So this is the Church of Pentecost. So these are the older apostles, the younger apostles, and these are 4 holy women. And this is based on the building of the upper room, which I did some drawings of in the Holy Land. So that's what that's based on. And then under here we have a figure from the Eastern Orthodox tradition, which is Cosmos. So if you look at the Pentecost scenes by the icons of the Eastern Orthodox, they have a figure called Cosmos who represents the world. So it's basically Eastern and Western Christianity, Old and New Testament, so I'm trying to bring it all together. And then Cosmos is pointing to the most important place in the world, which is Dublin. So this is just an exploration of theology. And then the light comes down behind the Holy Spirit onto the tabernacle. Shortly after that I met Pope Benedict, and I suggested un proposto Santa Padre un'Accademia di Belle Arti del Vaticano. So a proposal of the Holy Father, a Vatican Academy of Art. So this is really my dream, is to establish a Vatican Academy of Art. And shortly after that, I founded the Sacred Art School in Florence, with the Cardinal Archbishop as the honorary president. That's him opening the school. And this is the first project we did. So it's kind of like a bottega and a school, so a workshop and a school. So I did these altarpieces here for the Duomo in Florence on the life of St. Joseph, or St. John the Baptist, who's the patron. And then I did this bust of Pope Benedict for St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York City, Cardinal Dolan. And I did this bust of John Paul II. This is the Premier Catholic Award in Washington, D.C., which is given every year. This is me as a bishop. I was trying out I had to work out, I got a loan app from the Papal Nuncio in Ireland, Charlie Brown, lovely guy, to do this statue of Fulton Sheen in my backyard in Dublin. That's my mum on the right, and the Archbishop of Dublin on the left. So that was for Times Square. And then I did this for Milan. It's a Virgin Child. And I did this. This is a Fountain of Life. So this piece is it's inspired by the theology of the body of John Paul II. So there's a child at the top and a skeleton at the bottom. It's all about the crisis between the culture of life and the culture of death. So it's my kind of trying to process what's going on in the world. So I designed this original sketch in clay in 2001 in Rome. And then I did this in 2011 in Florence. And that was shipped to CUA a few months ago, and I hope that that will be, maybe you might pray for this, that it's been proposed as a piece on campus, as a fountain on campus, so to celebrate the victory over Roe versus Wade. So it's basically a celebration of life. So the child is pulling the couple up, and the skeleton is pulling the couple down. This is a crochet I was asked to do for an African bishop, so it's kind of quick. This is an altarpiece I did for a church. This is the headquarters of the Knights of Malta in Dublin. So just to understand, the drawing is 90% of any work of art. So drawing is essential because that's the logos, the form. And then from that, that's the drawing, and then from the drawing is composed the painting. So I had two friends of mine in Brooklyn, a studio in Brooklyn, that helped me put this piece together. So it's the essentially what's happening here is, I don't know if you can see, you have the Annunciation, the baptism of Christ, and the baptism of Christ, and then the decapitation of St. John the Baptist. So you'll notice that in each of the compositions, what I wanted to do is, and this is really important to understand the grammar within composition. So I'm using linear perspective in each of these compositions to bring you into the tabernacle. So you see this line here? The tabernacle is going to be here. So all the lines are bringing us into the tabernacle. And then the light source in each of these compositions all comes from the Holy Spirit. So the light in the central composition comes straight down. It comes from the left over here and right over here. Okay? So subconsciously, when you look at this altarpiece, you become aware of the centrality of Christ and the protagonist of the Holy Spirit in each composition. And this penetrates your mind as you're praying. Okay? So for sacred art to work, it has to come from prayer, because it's meant to lead to prayer. And one of the great problems with contemporary sacred art is that a lot of it is not artistically competent or spiritually competent. You cannot create liturgical art or liturgical architecture if you don't understand liturgy. And a lot of priests don't even understand liturgy today. Okay? So that's the crisis we're in. We have to pray about that. This is another church which I was asked to help design. So I did this mosaic for the front of it. So it's the Coronation of the Virgin. The reason I chose the Coronation of the Virgin is because this is for the University of Wisconsin. And the University of Wisconsin is really the founding, it's where feminism in the United States really took hold, okay? And the most beautiful feminine icon is the Madonna. And there's nothing more elevated than the Madonna, especially the coronation of the Madonna, Queen of Heaven. Why? Because there's one thing being God, but Mother of God is pretty good. So if you think about being Queen of Heaven, there is no greater honor given to a mere human being than to Our Lady. Okay? So this was my answer to feminism. A positive image. And I decided to use contemporary figures like Christ in the Passion, Caviezel, and to work it into the iconographic imagery, so as to create an image that would be suitable for, that would marry the Byzantine supernatural grammar of the Byzantine icon and bring it into a contemporary context, so as to bridge the ages. And this is how the mosaic is made, and this is how it looks on the front of the church. And this is at night time with the Eucharistic procession. That was the opening. And that's it across the piazza in Wisconsin. And that's me walking away with a check in my pocket. So the next thing I had to do was I wanted to understand deeper the great masters. So the best thing to do was to study the masters in the National Gallery. So I was very fortunate to meet my wife, Christine. We got married about 3 years ago. But as I was discerning that marriage, I couldn't work because I was on a fiancé visa. So I spent a whole year copying in the National Gallery every day, which is amazing, the most accessible gallery in the world. So I did this every day. Now, think of who would be the most interesting person for you to meet in your life? Who would you like to spend time conversing with?
Any historical figure or living?
Any figure. Plato, okay. In the National Gallery, as an artist, you have an opportunity to dialogue with every master for as long as you like, through your primary grammar, which is their primary grammar. Painting, sculpture. If you have a philosophical and theological understanding that they shared, like Titian, for instance, I could dialogue directly with him through his greatest masterpieces. That's the access we have. If you have the formation to access it. This is education. Now, Roger Scruton talks about this, the philosopher I was talking about earlier on. It's one thing to have the great masterpieces, but it's pretty useless if we don't have access to them. You can have the statue of David, you can have Titian's painting of the Duke, but if you can't dialogue with this in the same grammar, in the same philosophical and theological and artistic context, the same truth, the same goodness, the same beauty, if you don't share that grammar, You don't have access to this work. And that's the job of the university, is to give you access to your inheritance. And this is not only a right, this is a responsibility that each of us have. I'm a professor in the CUA, and I feel this responsibility deeply. That it's not just my right to do this, it's my responsibility to do this, because the next generation, I owe it to them. So that's why I do this. This is Raphael's album Madonna. This is a copy that I'm working on. This is El Greco's Madonna and Child, also in the National Gallery. And this is how I bring these masters together. So I amalgamate them together. So this is the next level. One thing is to copy them, and then it's to internalize them and make them part of your grammar. Okay? That's how, for instance, that's how James Joyce wrote Ulysses. Through studying Dante, through studying the Iliad, the Odyssey, studying Shakespeare, he managed to pull this masterpiece together through an understanding of the great masters. So it's on the shoulders of giants that we achieve this. So I'm grappling here with the great masters of painting to create a new composition. This is me working from nature as well. So in the Natural History Museum in DC, I'll be working from natural images there of creatures. And this is me grappling with, for instance, this is how it can become very handy. This is me, painting has been an interesting transition for me, because sculpture has been very much a masculine aspect of my life, because it's very rhetorical, it's very projecting. Whereas for painting is much more feminine for me, because it's much more contemplative, it's much more receptive, it's much more intellectual. And I find painting is a great way for me to process, because women process in a different way than guys. And painting for me has been a very interesting way to process. For instance, trying to process 2020. This is me trying to process 2020, okay? This is me grappling with, am I getting married? Am I not getting married? What am I doing here in the United States in 2020? The place is burning down. I feel completely vulnerable. I'm hanging off this nation, but I don't know what's holding me up. And really what's holding me up is what's behind the flag. Can you see what's behind the flag?
Cross.
The white cross, okay? So it's the faith. It's what I really value in the United States is the faith of the Americans. Because that's what's holding this country together. That's holding me in the air. This is a painting I did about the death of my father. This is a piece I did for the cathedral in Armagh in Northern Ireland. So it's St. Oliver Plunkett, who is the Archbishop of Armagh, 350 years before this event. So this is celebrating that by the contemporary Archbishop of Armagh. So he was a martyr who was basically hung, drawn, and quartered in Tyburn, one of the last martyrs. And this is another famous priest in Longford, near Armagh, who basically helped the starving people of Ireland during the famine. So this is a famine figure in front of him. This is a piece, this is a clay sketch about that size for a war memorial I'm doing at the moment, which is kind of interesting enough. It's for the 25th anniversary of September 11. So to be in New York during September 11 was kind of interesting now to actually be doing a monument for the US Navy for those who have died since September 11. So this is a memorial I'm designing for them, and we just signed the contract for it. So there'll be 6 7-foot bronze figures for the headquarters of the US Navy in Annapolis. So that's what this is, just to give you an idea. So it's a clay sketch. So that gives you an idea of how these compositions are started. And there's a final image which kind of sums up what I'm talking about here. I don't know if you're familiar with hermeneutic. Anybody understand what the word hermeneutic means? Hermeneutic is kind of like the grammar, the hermeneutic of continuity is how we understand, how we communicate continuity. Okay. In art, I see this crisis. I see traditional art and contemporary art. There's a rupture. Okay. And what I want to address in this talk is that rupture and the necessity to bridge the gap so that there is continuity and not rupture. That's the essential message of what I'm talking about here. Any questions?
So you talk about the progression of the schools from like the Italian Ortegas and then eventually into the French school, the salons, the Impressionists and so on. Where, in your opinion, do you start to see the departure of beauty?
Very interesting question. I would see it very parallel to Descartes. So the birth of relativism, I think, is really where things start to go downhill. That's my personal opinion. I'm not a philosopher, but I love philosophy and theology. So where I see relativism enter, it starts to deny truth. And when you start denying truth, you start denying goodness, and you start denying beauty. And it's interesting that happens after the Baroque. Ratzinger talks about the three major liturgical art movements are the iconography, icons essentially, and then you have the Gothic, and you have the Baroque, but the best of the Baroque, okay? Not all Baroque. And it's shortly after that we get Descartes, and we get the birth of relativism, and then the self-destruction of philosophy and theology and art. And when we get to the First World War, it just like plunges. And that's where we get 1917, you get the Duchamp's urinal, which is basically where Duchamp takes a urinal and puts it in a gallery and says, that's art. And his statement was very clever at the time. Basically, art is dead. That's where he was saying. But the problem is that that message has been repeated ad nauseum for over 100 years. It's getting a little tiring. I think it's time to resurrect art at this stage, and that's what I'm trying to do. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah.
So I was in DC this summer. I went to the Basilica a couple of times for mass and also to visit to see the art. And I noticed that a lot of people visit it as a tourist destination and see these icons as spectacles.
Yeah.
And as like a tourist destination rather than like an avenue to prayer. So I was wondering what you think the church's responsibility is to keep these pieces of art as forms of prayer, sacred art instead of spectacles.
Okay, well, the first responsibility is to think liturgically. So understand liturgy. Okay, cult, culture, politics. We have to get that hierarchy very clear, because even if we deny it, it's still there. The cult will be the Catholic Church, it will be Christ, or it will be pornography, or it will be Hollywood, or it will be football. Okay, so that hierarchy will be. So you have to think liturgically and have a correct liturgy, correctly ordered liturgy, which is towards Christ, which is towards love, which is towards the fullness of the human person. First thing is that, understand liturgy. So that's the priest's responsibility. And the priest, understanding liturgy, has to transmit that to the artist. So Michelangelo didn't do the Sistine Chapel on his own. He was informed by theologians to do that, okay? So you have to inform the artist and the architecture in liturgy so that the building and the art follows liturgy. And that, if it follows liturgy, it will guide the people towards prayer, okay? So if the building is correctly built, the building will tell you how to pray. There'll be kneelers, there'll be altar rails, there'll be an altar. Everything will be correctly ordered to orient you towards what is important. So in one word, orientation is what's is the necessity. The problem with contemporary culture is we are disoriented, okay? Which means that we need to be oriented, which means in liturgy, I'll make no exception, I make no apology for saying this, we need ad orientem. We need to turn towards the Lord, okay? That is the correct order. The tabernacle is here, okay? That symbolizes the east. or the Orient, okay? That's where Christ resurrects. Right? So we need to be ad orientem, praying towards God. That means that everybody is praying together. The priest is leading us towards the Lord. Right? A really interesting, really fun cartoon I saw that illustrated this. Was beautiful. It was basically two school buses. Okay? One was the driver driving, and all the kids are fun, having a laugh and singing in the back. And the next one is the driver turning towards the kids, and all the kids going, ah! Because the driver doesn't know where he's going. Okay? And it's turning in on itself. And if a culture turns in on itself, if a person turns in on itself, it becomes very, I hate to use the word, but it's a strong word, it begins with N. It's not procreative, put it that way. You know where I'm coming from? Okay? If you don't give your love, it turns in on yourself, and it's not procreative. It's self-destructive. And that's what's happened to our church. In a nutshell, ad orientem is the key, number one, solution. So when it comes to your question, the art needs to orient people towards prayer. Now, one of the big problems with the basilica is that you can see very clearly what I'm illustrating here in the basilica. The architecture is beautiful. Why? Because the architects knew how to draw. To draw is to think visually. Okay? The architect of the basilica was a master. It's a gorgeous building. And that really succeeds in the crypt. If you go to the crypt, you can really pray in the crypt. You're totally distracted upstairs. Why? Because upstairs, for the crypt, the art in the crypt was done by people who knew how to draw. It was at that period. But in the 60s and 70s, all that self-destructed, and no one knew how to draw. So upstairs, most of the art is hideous. Why? Because the artist couldn't draw. If you can't draw, you're not an artist as far as I'm concerned. Okay? So the art upstairs, a lot of it is very ugly. So it's very distracting. And it doesn't lead you to prayer. In other words, an artist has to pray in order to be able to put a spiritual content into his work, which will lead people to pray. If the artist doesn't pray, how the hell are the people going to pray? So I think that's part of the problem. So I think the primary responsibility is with the church itself. The church needs to teach the priests how to understand liturgy and to project forward. And that will lead everybody else. But as an artist, I see, when you point your finger, 3 fingers are pointing back at you. So when I saw a problem with the church, when I read John Paul II's letter to artists in 1999, which is nearly 25 years ago, I knew these were my marching orders. This is my problem. I got to resolve it. And that's what I'm doing as an artist. But by doing that, I'm also trying to lead others to their responsibilities. So.
In your opinion, what do you think that non-artists can do to help restore sacred art?
First thing is understand it. Try and internalize it, understand the beauty of it. Try and support artists to learn how to do that. Try and support priests to commission the work, if it's liturgical art you're talking about. First thing, try and understand yourself, because it would be a tremendous aid for your own interior life to understand the power and beauty of sacred art. That's why Ratzinger, when he released the Compendium of the Catholic Church, the Compendium of the Catechism of the Catholic Church, he made a point of putting art in it and using the art to teach. Okay, it's really important theological instrument, and we need to pick that up. And I think that's the first thing, is to inform yourself of the beauty and power of art to transform your heart and help others, and try and form others and make them aware of it. And if you want, put them in contact with me and I can help them. I have cards if you want. Yep.
How is Ireland kind of like, it's a very beautiful country, how has that informed you as an artist, or how has it added to your art?
Ireland, unfortunately, for visual artists, it's not great, because a lot of it's directly linked with the climate. So Northern European artists tend to be musicians and writers. They're things you do by the fireside, inside. You don't need natural light, okay? So you know the Germans and the English and the Scottish and the Irish, they all tend to be musicians and writers, okay? But visual artists, Ireland's not a great place for visual art because we're covered with a duvet of cloud 99% of the time. So we don't see the sun, like we believe in the sun, but we don't see very much of it. And Christine, my wife, will tell you, I pinch myself every day to see the sun. That's how bad it is, okay? I think if you go to the Mediterranean, it's really interesting that you see the Mediterranean culture, the Spanish, the Italians, the French, the Greeks, master artists, sculptors, painters. So once Ireland became part of the European Union and they opened the borders in 1990, I was out of there. I was straight to Barcelona. I was into Florence. I was out of Ireland as quick as I could possibly be because I needed that light. That light really pops the floor. And Gaudí said once, the architect in Barcelona who did the Sagrada Familia, he talks about the Mediterranean light coming at a particular angle which really pops the form and inspires the artist, and I totally identify with that.
So I know you mentioned like going to just like being in art school and stuff, at least, and how it's very clear that like the arts and academia and all of that has been pretty much like overrun by anti-Christian sentiment and people who don't believe in truth and basically reject all transcendentals. So do you feel as though the beauty of Catholic art, Christian art, is enough to sort of win back these institutions, or do you feel that there's some, like, how can artists, kind of like Catholic artists, enter into these institutions and make changes for the better? Or do you feel as though we really do need to just kind of like make our own institutions? Are they all kind of just like too far gone to?
Yeah, it's a very good question. Like, for instance, when I was a student in the New York Academy of Art, one of my tutors was a famous artist. I won't mention his name because it might be embarrassing. He sold his work for over $1 million. He was in the Metropolitan Museum. He was a really big shot, okay? And he was my tutor. I didn't want him because I was a sculptor, he was a painter, but I had him for 2 years. It was a real education because I just basically, we were meant to have a half-hour critique every week. We ended up at least an hour and a half each week. I would just like resist everything he said. I just like BS, and he would argue with me. And that way I got him to think and he got me to think. Now this guy is a leading force in the New York art world. But through that I got to understand, like at one stage we had a real standoff. And he said, I asked him, look, how can a Catholic like me make it in the New York art world? He said, oh, you can do like Christoffoli, he did like the Madonna with the elephant dung and the pornographic images. You know, he's Catholic, right? I said, no, that's anti-Catholic. Said, okay, well what about the guy who did the Piss Christ? You know, it's like, you know, he's Catholic, isn't he? No, that's anti-Catholic. And he said, what about the woman that's in the Brooklyn Museum? She did this Last Supper with all the apostles as naked women. I said, no, I don't think you get it. And he says, okay, right, I'm going to lunch. I'll see you after lunch. So he went to lunch, came back straight after lunch. He said, you won't believe who I met at lunch. It was like the lady who did the Last Supper with the naked women. And he said, yeah, I told her about you and the conversations we had. So I thought, it'd be really cool for you guys to chat. So I invited her up to chat with you. And she wouldn't come. I said, hello? So I said, that's the kind of, you know, misconnection that there is. So I would say, basically, plow your own field. Find your own constituency, serve your people. God knows there's a lot of people out there that need beauty and they need great liturgical art. Just make it and they will come. Absolutely.
So you've talked a lot about sacred art specifically. Is there a space for art that's not necessarily sacred art, might not even be Christian art? Is there value in that beauty as well, and what does that look like?
Absolutely, absolutely. The only reason I talk about sacred art is because, and liturgical art, is because from my experience, through my own personal experience and also through the experience of art history, is that geographically and historically, sacred art is the essence of a culture. So you go to Aztec art, You go to Greek art. It's a sacred art that really is the synthesis of all those art forms, those cultures, right? So if you want to renew a culture, you renew its sacred art. Because it's like a drop of Indian ink in a glass of water. It penetrates everything, okay? So if you get the liturgy right, the cult, then the culture is right, then the politics is right. If you get the sacred art right, then the portraits will be right, and the landscapes will be right, and every other art form that comes from that. It's like the ice caps of a mountain. It melts down and penetrates the whole land. Does that make sense?
I hadn't heard the remark before by Ratzinger about the icons and the Gothic and the Baroque as these three like big kind of moments in Christian art.
It's in Spirit of the Liturgy by Ratzinger.
Okay.
Great book, one of his greatest books.
Is there a kind of period or style of art that you consider to be the most Christian?
Well, look, it depends on what you're needing. Personally, I find the iconographic really good for the sanctuary, because the sanctuary, let's say this is the church and this is the sanctuary here, or that's the altar and the sanctuary is here. Anything inside this space, I think, really should be led. This is the eschaton, this is the end times, right? This is heaven, right? The sanctuary. This is the procession of life. So the nave is contemporary man, historical man, as John Paul II talks about in his theology of life. Know and understand and internalize the theology of body if you get a chance. It is crucial and foundational to what I'm talking about here. Theology of the Body by John Paul II. Christopher West makes a very popular way of understanding. But back to our question. This is eschatological man. This is the end times. Okay, this is where we should be in heaven. Here is historical, okay, the procession. And I believe that the eschaton, this is the suitable art for the sanctuary, is art that represents the eschaton, represents the end times, represents heaven, the heavenly existence, the presence of the angels, the presence of the saints. So a very supernatural abstraction. All art is abstract. People say, oh, there's figurative and there's abstract. No, all art is abstract. You cannot have art without abstraction. The difference I indicate here is that there is informed abstraction and uninformed abstraction. Informed abstraction, uninformed abstraction, okay? Informed abstraction gives you beauty, uninformed abstraction gives you ugliness, okay? The same comes with your artist, as your plumber, as your accountant. If they don't understand you and your needs, they do this, okay? The artist has the same responsibility. So back to what we were saying. This is the sanctuary, this is the eschaton. So this art should be more iconographic in its orientation. It's abstracting towards, to bring us into another space, a sacred space. Here, in the nave, you could have more Baroque work, which is much more historical man. It's man wrestling with dark and light, fallen nature, the theater, the theatrical contrast of life. Okay, and then the Gothic is kind of in between, where it's historical man wrestling with the eschaton. Does that make sense? Any other questions?
I was wondering a little bit about what you were saying about liturgy, how we need to get liturgy right, because culture and politics are going to be downstream from liturgy. And then one thing that you mentioned to get liturgy right was, I think, orientation.
Yeah.
That was one of your answers, one of the questions that we need. Our art and the things need to be pointing to God. Were there any other ways that you were thinking of how we can get liturgy right, or how we can, because it seems like to restore sacred art and even art, now we also have to restore sacred liturgy. Were there any other ways that you thought of that we could take a step towards doing that?
Well, central is restoring the liturgy. Other ways is really learning the vocabulary. Like, for instance, I found that the Irish Academy figure, the first thing I did was found the Irish Academy of Figurative Art in 2004. The reason I did that was to give academic training, so basic natural understanding, natural artistic understanding. So teaching anatomy, drawing, painting, sculpture, so as to understand the grammar of the incarnation. That's a good groundwork. So that's very Aristotelian, which you can bring to a Thomistic level. So you have an Aristotelic understanding, which is like tangible, and then from the tangible you can build up to the supernatural. So from the natural, grace is built on nature, so as Aquinas talks about. So if you understand the nature, then you can sanctify that and elevate it, right? So I think that's a really good way, and that's why I started that way. But I got a bit frustrated because a lot of students were just like being really talented and brilliant and knocking each other around, and it's just celebrating their egos. So I said, no, I don't want to be just creating these artistic monsters. I want to put it to the service of love, and that's why I started the Sacred Art School in Florence. And that's where the rubber hit the road, and that's where like 14 people converted. And that's just conversions, like baptisms. But like so many of them came to the faith through that, and they're friends. So it's a really powerful apostolic tool.
Well, thank everyone for coming to the event. Let's please give some. Then I'll have some refreshments and a chance to talk with Mr. McManus. Yeah.
Thank you for coming, guys. If you need cards, I have them.